Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, your podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Today, I have a great pleasure to host Sary Zananiri. Sary is an artist and a cultural historian. His interests sit at the intersection of religion, colonialism, and visual culture, with a particular focus on the ways in which social and cultural histories can explicate the contemporary. With Sary, we're going to talk about Western vision and photography of Jerusalem in history. And also through his latest exhibitions, we're going to talk about pictures of contemporary Jerusalem and in particularly of Mamilla. Without further ado, Sary, welcome.
Thanks, Roberto.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged. And as usual, the first question is, what is your Jerusalem? In other words, what is your connection to the city?
Well, I suppose there's a few different kinds of connections that I have to Jerusalem. One is coming from a Jerusalemite family. So the Zananiris are from Jerusalem. They're a Greek Orthodox family. But during my undergraduate studies, I started getting a little bit interested in site-responsive and site-specific artwork. So thinking about how you can respond to a certain place and work within that. So when I started doing my postgraduate work, one of the things that I started really thinking about is about Jerusalem as a site of absence. And I think, particularly growing up in Australia for the most part as a diaspora Palestinian, there was this very interesting kind of space in which to think about the city, which is, it's so photographed and it's such a part of, Western visual culture in many respects, particularly religious Western visual culture. And so I started thinking about how I could kind of work with some of those images as an artist. And I suppose that's both how I got interested in it as an artist, but also as a scholar.
Sary, then this leads me to ask you a question. So are you an artist or are you a scholar?
Well, my PhD, which is, I believe, not very common outside of Australia, it was actually a practice-based PhD. So it was a studio PhD in which I produced both artwork as well as a PhD thesis or dissertation. For me, I see the relationship between an art practice and a more sort of textual academic practice as being quite integrated, rather than something that's separate. And I also think when I'm considering different ideas and, there's different ways of engaging different audiences with similar material, although in very different ways, through whether it's through, making an artwork, curating an exhibition, or writing a journal article or a book or whatever it happens to be. So I think, in some ways, it's a very porous relationship for me, and I find that the two interact in different ways. I also think coming from an arts background, you have a slightly different approach to how you think about images and how you think about how artworks function and how culture functions, I suppose there's sort of questions that get thrown up about the intent of an artist or an author, or how things get read, what the slippage is between those things, how different images might relate to other images on a formal level rather than on a historical level. And so I think, in some ways there is a slightly different way of thinking about things, which is sort of perhaps a little bit more unusual in historical kind of contexts. So I think, in some ways there is a sort of a visual literacy which kind of positions you in such a way that you can think slightly differently about how how to read an image and how an image kind of functions within a sort of a public space. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and it's fascinating to see how passion and work can come together and produce something original and different. And in this case, I really want to start asking questions to Sary, the scholar, but I'm pretty sure that Sary, the artist, will come into the conversation. You published an article on the Jerusalem Quarterly a few years back, and the article talked about how Jerusalem was represented in Western, better say, biblical imagery and imagination. Can you take us through a journey in order to understand how the West essentially captured Jerusalem through photography using the lenses of the Bible?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think partially it's to do with technology in the first instance. Photography is something that was invented in 1839 and it spread quite rapidly. But certainly within early photographic technological development, you had very long exposure time. So you tended to have, those early photographic images, they didn't tend to have people so much. So people is something that you kind of get later on in the sort of 1860s, 1870s. But I think one of the things that's so fascinating about photography in Palestine, and indeed in the region more generally, is that there does seem to be a little bit of a lag, between the photographing of these landscapes and the photographing of people within those landscapes. So I think in some ways, the sort of technological flaw of photography actually had quite significant impacts on the Eastern Mediterranean. We see similar things with, say, the imaging of Greece as well, these very ancient landscapes, these sort of biblical sites in the case of Palestine, or ruins in, the case of Greece, or, the Northern Levant or Egypt, or, things like the pyramids. So there is actually much less interest in terms of a Western consumer of photography in the people that are there themselves. So we start to get this sort of precedent that's set visually in culture about this empty landscape. So for someone like Hassan Nassar, he would call this biblification in the case of Palestine. So thinking about these sort of Christian narratives. And when we start to look at the ways in which the West is interacting with the region more generally, we do start to see, when we look at diaries or memoirs or many of the published books on Palestine, we do see this sort of biblical cartography where people are kind of essentially using biblical text to read the landscape. They're not really interested in modern Palestine or modernity in the cultural sense rather than the historical sense. They're interested in these sort of ancient places. And so, long before 1948, we get this sort of like this sort of empty landscapes that would come to support like the Zionist idea of a land without people for a people without land. This sort of, this is something that long predates Zionism in a very interesting way visually. When we do start getting images of people, in the first instance, they tend to be more studio-based rather than in the open. And we see people like Bonfils, for instance, who was a Frenchman who started a photographic studio in Beirut. He's taking photos of authentic Samaritans, authentic Bedouins, authentic, Jews, authentic. When we actually start looking at his photography, one of the things that's so interesting is that you see the same models depicting these authentic frameworks time and time again. And that's a kind of a very, we sort of have to start thinking a little bit about what it is that we're actually looking at. And that's when photography starts to get very interesting for me personally. Because, we have these sort of commercial studios, we have people who are more interested in, scholarly activities, whether they're archaeologists or ethnographers or historians. We also have these sort of very interesting links to espionage in terms of photography. Certainly when we look at somebody like Charles Wilson of the Royal Engineers, who put together the Ordnance Survey of Jerusalem in the 1860s. Wilson, although he wasn't taking the photographs themselves, he was commissioning them. He certainly had these sort of amazing landscape photos of a city like Jerusalem that were ostensibly for the idea of bringing water supplies and firming up Jerusalem's water supplies. But he also went on later on in life to be the to set up what became British military intelligence and eventually MI5. So, when we think about photography, we really need to think a lot about the intent of photographers and what they're doing, but also about how we can read the photographs themselves. And I think, one of the things that's so interesting when we start looking at a lot of these photo archives of Palestine is that there is this very interesting intersection of popular culture, of sort of more scholarly kind of work, and then this sort of genre of military intelligence, which kind of sits on the peripheries of all of that. But often these three operate in tandem. So when we think about the history of photography in Palestine, it is in many ways entwined with colonialism, whether it's on a sort of a popular imaginary level, whether it's on a scholarly level, or whether it is through these sort of more military kinds of means. So I think, it occupies a very distinct place in Palestinian history to me.
This is wonderful. And while you were talking about photography and the various uses made by either, sort of colonial projects or the military, you briefly mentioned also the commercial aspect. And it made me think if there were any particular places where photographers, whether Westerners or locals, would stop, take a picture, and then essentially make a living out of those pictures. Are there any particular places through the city of Jerusalem other than Panorama? And obviously we're going to talk about one of the most important panorama that you discussed in your work. Are there any location throughout the city that was considered like somehow the most important, a location that could be photographed and then easily sold either in Jerusalem or even abroad?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's a number of locations like that. One of the sort of the most famous would be the view of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And I have to say, I've probably seen literally thousands of of those photos, and it's very fascinating because when you start to survey the same photo taken from the same vantage point over time, you start to get a very distinct sense of this sort of build-up and the changes, in terms of urban planning, etc. But I think the other thing that you asked was about locals and visiting photographers, and I think that's worth unpacking a little bit as well, because I think local photographers and visiting photographers are two different categories, even though their interests often overlap. Visiting photographers generally were interested in these kind of more biblical kind of narratives. Local photographers, on the other hand, they certainly were interested in that for a Western market, but they're also taking a very different set of photographs, which are of local people for local consumption. And so, I think there's a sort of a very interesting kind of interplay that happens between local and foreign photographers in terms of the photographing of Palestine. I think some of the more famous examples, people like Khalil Raad, for instance, he took plenty of these very sort of biblical images, but they are slightly different. They're still aimed at a Western market. We get classic images like the one that he has of a girl who's collecting wheat, which he titles Ruth the Gleaner. It falls very much into this sort of trope of images that are for Western consumption. But if we look at the way she's interacting with the camera, she's looking directly at the camera lens. There's a bit more of a sort of a sense of her own self and a sense of confidence. Whereas often when we look at some of these sort of Bonfils photos, they're not looking directly at the camera, or the famous kind of example that Ilyas Sanbar puts together are the two photos of a girl from Bethlehem, both titled A Girl from Bethlehem, one of by Bonfils and one by Khalil Raad. And the difference between the two photos is quite remarkable. You know, the Bonfils photograph, you know, she's not really, they're both basically wearing exactly the same costume. But in the Bonfils one, she's not looking at the camera. She's sort of slightly reclined. She's a little bit sort of withdrawn versus the Rad photograph where she's looking directly into the camera. She's smiling. She's looking quite gregarious and happy and upbeat. You know, and I think that Rad photo is one of the photos that kind of starts getting us to think a little bit about the ways in which the context of a photograph being taken might affect its meaning. Now, knowing Bonfils's work, we know that he's probably just given whatever model a Bethlehemite costume. With the Rad photograph, on the other hand, it's quite possible that she's a model, but it's also quite possible that she's engaging in this sort of Palestinian tradition of dressing up in costume and having your photo taken. And I think that's a really interesting sort of thing to think about, because these middle-class Palestinians very rarely wore these traditional costumes. They were, you know, they were urban. They were wearing suits, ties, dresses, etc. in the Western style. You know, sometimes with a tarbush or something like that. But you know, it's a very sort of different relationship. So a photograph like that starts to throw up some very interesting questions about who that person was and she was interacting. And I think, you know, within that genre of what I sometimes call Bedouin drag, for want of a better term, you know, there's sort of multiple things that, you know, multiple suppositions that we might make. You know, is this a projection of nationalism? Is this a sort of a classist joke? Is this, you know, a means of sort of claiming some sort of indigeneity? So I think, you know, when we start sort of thinking about some of these photographs and these sort of quite famous biblical oriental tropes, to circle back to your original question, like I think we need to sort of think about the ways in which a photograph might not give us a full story, you know, about reading a sort of a larger context, not just about a famous site, but even sort of a well-known trope of imaging.
Thinking about the question of photographs and stories, I was wondering if the Zananiri family moving away from Jerusalem brought back pictures, photographs, and if you had a chance to access that material and perhaps share with us some of those stories that are embedded within those pictures.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite of the Zananiri photos is actually a photograph of my grandfather and a friend of his, and they are dressed up in costume in this photo. His friend is wearing a abaya and a kafiyya and a agal. And my grandfather, who I have to say I always knew as a very stern Palestinian patriarch, you know, he was not a man that during my childhood ever seemed to have any sort of sense of humor, is sitting there and he's dressed up in a dress. So so he's actually cross-dressing, wearing this you know, sort of playing this role of a woman within this sort of very sort of stereotypical kind of village/Bedouin drag photo. So not only is there a sort of a transgression of class boundaries, but there's a sort of a gender transgression there. And I remember when I first saw that photo, I thought it was the most hilarious thing ever. So I think you know, I think that's sort of partially, you know, one of the things that I find so interesting about photography is how it perhaps upsets some of these sort of narratives that we bring to them when we start to look at them.
Your grandfather sounds like
very...
was a man of a great sense of humor.
I suspect he must have been at some point in his life, but I missed out on most of it, unfortunately.
Staying on this and thinking and reflecting upon the values of pictures, I was wondering, what is the range of emotions that you experience when you unpack a photo album, when you start looking at pictures of Jerusalem, whether it's a panorama, a view, a building, or even photographs including individuals, people, real women, men, children walking around the streets of Jerusalem?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it obviously depends on the contents of an archive. And I've also spent I've spent the last 10 years of my life now looking at photographs, particularly of Jerusalem, but of Palestine generally. So I do feel like in some ways, I think what I look for and what I get excited by is something that's a little bit different. I think when we, to go back to those sort of classic scenes of, Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, or the facade of the Holy Sepulchre, or the various sort of holy sites, there is something very interesting about them in their accumulation over time. But there's something quite special when you start delving through these archives, when you start to find everyday scenes or family albums or images of people kind of going about their daily routine, because you start to see a different sort of Jerusalem, like it's a much more social space. One of the photographers who I've been doing a lot of work on is a Dutch photographer called Frank Scholten, for instance. And he's a very curious character, he goes off to Palestine with this idea of producing an illustrated Bible. He takes approximately 20,000 photographs in the early 1920s. But one of the things about the Scholten collection that I really love is that they're really animated photos. He's going at a time when you had portable cameras that were relatively available. He comes from this background of the Dutch aristocracy, so finances don't play any sort of role in sort of guiding his lens. So he's able to financially take as many photos as he wants, but also he's not necessarily thinking about photography in a commercial sense in terms of what people will buy. So it is sort of this it's very much an individual's perspective on Palestine. Admittedly, he spent a lot more time taking photos in Jaffa than he did in Jerusalem. But when we start to look at his photos of Jerusalem, we get this amazing sense of how Palestinian communal life was changing in the early 1920s, particularly in a very ethnically diverse city like Jerusalem. We get these images of Armenians, we get the beginnings of Jewish communities establishing themselves. We get, many, many photos of Christians, because that's his main sort of, drive. We get photos of well-known personalities like Ya'qub Bukhari. We get, all of these sort of, like you start to get a sense of the social life of the city. So I think for me, there's a sense of excitement when I find photographs that give me some sort of sense of that sociality, obviously there's plenty of archaeologists who took photos, and those photos are interesting in a different way, but there's only so many sort of, so much excitement that you can expend on, holes in the ground or rocks or So I think the thing that floats my boat is the sort of social sense of the city.
Given your work as a scholar, so your professional approach to photography, but also your sensibility as an artist, I was just thinking when you were talking about this photographer, this Dutch photographer, are you able to essentially take their place behind the camera? In other words, can you put yourself in the place of a photographer and see what they can see what they saw, or experience what they were trying to communicate?
I think with the work on Scholten in particular, I don't know how successful it is to imagine that I can take his place, but I do feel like there is a sort of a sensitivity to thinking about how he thinks. And one of the things that I do really appreciate about him in particular, apart from the very large amount of photographs that he took, he also collected photographs of Palestine. And so in some ways, I think he's a really interesting case study for someone like me, because he is, on the one hand, collecting images as well as making them himself. And I think, there's something kind of fascinating when I dig through his archive of photographs and see some of his annotations, and a lot of them have a biblical verse on them. So when you start thinking about the biblical verse and how that relates to the image, and trying to sort of understand some of his religiosity, it's like, it is very much an artist's archive. It's, I think he's a very difficult person to pin down in many ways, because he was interested in so many different things. And when we look at the texts that he was referencing, he was looking at theological texts and language comparison between different versions of the Bible. He was looking at Palestinian history. He's looking at popular theological tracts. He's looking at imaging of the Bible in art history. He's got this whole collection of postcards, and you start to see all of these sort of religious narratives that kind of play out in different ways. He was also queer and had this real fixation on the figure of David, which is a really interesting kind of case study when we sort of think about the David as a sort of a symbol in the Renaissance, and how he's sort of being reinterpreted and then reinterpreted again, and some of that collection of David, it runs from very famous renditions like Michelangelo's David through to a version by Arnold Zadikov, who was a Jewish artist who produced this new Jewish David. Zadikov, interestingly enough, would go on to design the tomb for Magnus Hirschfeld after he died. So there's also this sort of strange kind of queer connection there that sort of cycles around. So he's sort of, there is a sort of a sense of my historian self doesn't feel like I can kind of make this comment, but my artist self, I think it's a slightly different story. But I do sort of get the impression that Scholten is someone who's really very actively trying to justify his homosexuality through biblical narrative when you start looking at that. And so it's sort of, it becomes a really interesting archive in terms of trying to understand a personality, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes absolutely sense. And I was thinking about the question of representation. Taking pictures of others sometimes is a way to express yourself. So obviously, even talking about David and the fact that there's been plenty of speculation and studies about the sexuality of David. So that makes kind of a statement, I would say, out in the public. Now, talking about your work, there is one leitmotif, like a picture that I've seen, discussed many times in your work, which is the Peopleheim Panorama. And I really hope also to post this picture as a sort of a face for this podcast. And I was wondering if you can tell us what is this panorama is, what does it represent, and why it's so important?
Yeah, look, the Peopleheim Panorama it's fascinating, because it sort of, again, draws on a whole series of different things. And it's also the first of what became a family of panoramas of Jerusalem on the day of the crucifixion. For those who might not be so familiar with the form of the panorama, it's essentially a 360-degree painting. So it's kind of like a pre-cinema version of cinema. And they were quite a serious commercial enterprise, particularly in the 19th century, but also before that. So they tend to be quite large paintings. I think Peopleheim's original panorama was about 10 or 11 meters high and something like 100 meters in circumference. And when you enter one of these panoramas, you get your ticket as you would for going into the cinema, and then you walk through a dark hall, and then up a spiral staircase onto a central platform, and from there you're completely immersed in the panorama. So Peopleheim Panorama originally was sort of a German response to the sort of the Belgian monopoly on panoramas that was going on in the sort of late 1870s into the 1880s. And it took him about 4 years to actually produce the panorama. Panoramas, mostly the genre panoramas generally was more sort of contemporary cityscapes or historical battle scenes. There were other sort of themes that they had, but there is something very unusual in the picking of a historical context for the depiction of Jerusalem. So even other panoramas that were taken in the region, whether they were of Constantinople or Cairo or other major cities, they showed them in their 19th century actuality. So, I mean, I think this sort of, on the one hand, hints at how lucrative the biblical was in terms of marketing to a Western audience, but also kind of speaks to some of the exceptionalism that had developed out of photography around the ways in which Palestine was imaged and photographed. Now, the panorama was a complete success. And it actually led to a copy that was produced in London. The Peopleheim's Panorama had been on display in Munich and was supposed to go to London. So actually there was a whole legal case that went on around between these two rival panorama companies. So while Peopleheim was contractually obliged not to copy the panorama, the artists who worked on the team weren't. So this spawned a whole series of these different panoramas that were, sort of shown throughout Europe and North America, and there's only 3 of them left out of, I think there was 14 or 15 in total, if I recall correctly, which is a little bit sad. But it does sort of show how powerful this sort of biblical image was. And the fact that they went to the trouble of sort of suing this company who showed the panorama in London, it gives a sense of the amounts of money that were also involved in the sort of the production of these panoramas. But on a visual level, it's such a spectacular thing to see them. I remember seeing there's one in Quebec in Canada. So I went to have a look at it, and it really, it's quite an experience, and I think the logic of it because it's circular, it's sort of, you wind up looping back to the beginning of the story. And the ways in which they're painted, they're very, very simple. I mean, the quality of the painting is amazing. So when Peopleheim went to Palestine, he took many, many photos and made all of these preparatory sketches. So on the one hand, he's very faithful to the topography of Jerusalem. But on the other hand, in terms of the content that kind of goes in there, there's a completely sort of fantastical sort of element to the painting itself. It's not at all based on the physical Jerusalem of the 19th century, beyond this sort of this topography. And, kind of coming from this background of panorama painting where authenticity is the thing that's really used to sell them, he's really kind of playing on the idea of authenticity and presenting an authentic first century Jerusalem to the general public. And so, when we really think about that and how that relates back to photography, there's something really fascinating there, because he's taking all of these photos, which are then made seamless through the act of painting the panorama. And one of the things that's very interesting about the panorama is that it's a very populated space. So where a lot of photos in that period don't have a lot of people in them, there are actually many, many people in the panorama, whether that's sort of key players like Christ and the Roman soldiers and, the Virgin Mary and, those sorts of players, or all of these sort of what we might call filler kind of people, And one of the things that's very interesting about them is that they're all wearing 19th century Palestinian costume. And so again, sort of thinking back to photography and this sort of question of authenticity, there is this thing that gets established in this period that is sort of like an idea of what authentically first century looks like. And that's basically 19th century rural Palestinian. And so, we get this very sort of interesting interplay where costuming becomes kind of equated with authenticity, whether that's in a Bonfils photograph or in a panorama, or indeed later on in Hollywood cinema. So there's something very interesting about these sort of visual kind of conventions that becomes made concrete in that second half of the 19th century in this visual culture.
These panorama essentially were some sort of a 3D experience before 3D was invented. And I wish one day I'm going to try to experience that. It sounds really fascinating just to somehow walk through a painting and get the sense of, in this case, of a crucifixion, which was, I guess, a very interesting choice, but commercially speaking, I suppose, very successful. You mentioned Hollywood, and I was wondering, before we're going to move and talk about Sary, the artist, how does Hollywood paint Jerusalem? Is there any way you came across how Hollywood discussing, painting, also through photography, image, the city of Jerusalem?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, I think Hollywood. Hollywood has had I think it takes a lot of its cues from photography, but it's had a very significant impact on the way Jerusalem is imaged. If we look at the interwar period, we get a lot of Hollywood biblical epics that are produced there. There's quite a number by Cecil B. DeMille. There's King of Kings. There's a whole bunch of them. One of the things that's very interesting about silent film is that it has these intertitles, where you get the textual sections. And there's a sort of an interplay between these moving tableaus and these textual sections that interpret what you've just seen, whether that's through dialogue or whatever. And I think this sort of interplay between image and text, it's a very interesting one in the case of Palestine, particularly in terms of biblical reading, because there is always this sort of sense of flicking backwards and forwards between the image and text. How do we read this landscape? We read it through text, whether through biblical text. We often see with the photographs that are produced that there is a written annotation interpreting what's there, or putting a little biblical verse in, or whatever it happens to be. And I think, even though the silent films of the interwar period are, they are actual films, and the film industry would change when sound isn't, but they are sort of somehow working within these sort of biblical conventions in a way that is slightly different to, say, a more secular film about a love story, or a swashbuckling pirate adventure, or whatever it happens to be. But the thing that's so fascinating is that they pick up on this question of costuming. So you do see keffiyehs of a certain variety, you do see veils, you do see all of this sort of costuming that was still quite contemporary in that period being played out as authentically biblical. And that definitely carries through to, Hollywood cinema of the post-war period. By the time we get to the post-war period, we get a very distinct sort of shift, and a very politicized shift. So we start seeing a lot of these sort of Hollywood epics that are essentially using biblical narrative within a sort of a broader Cold War narrative. So we start to see this very interesting sort of interplay of geopolitics. Christianity becomes a liberatory force and a force for democracy, and it's about fighting empire and fighting this sort of, this corrupt Roman old world. And so we sort of see America marking itself through biblical narrative. And when we start getting to some of the later ones, in the 60s, rather than the ones that are sort of late 40s and 50s, we get films like George Stevens' Greatest Story Ever Told. And to be honest, I find it a terribly boring film, but from a sort of an analytical perspective, it is fascinating. I mean, George Stevens, he went through, like Peopleheim, he went through this enormous process of research. It took him 10 years to develop the script for the greatest story ever told. And he interviewed people from the Pope through to Menachem Begin in terms of developing the script. And when he was thinking about filming locations, he made this really interesting comment, because he decided in the end to film it in the US. And he says something like, the Colorado is not the River Jordan, but we can do it better here. So there's a whole remaking of the biblical image in the image of America that goes on. It's super fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like Hollywood always had an eye on the city of Jerusalem and on Palestine, obviously for commercial reasons, but in the end, they never really captured the city and the region itself. I mean, even The Passion of Mel Gibson was eventually shot in this city in the south of Italy, Matera. So in the end, Jerusalem is the object, but never becomes the subject, or maybe the opposite, is the subject of the movies, but never becomes really the object of filming. And it's only, I would say, more the contemporary industry really taking, steps forward to use this city locations, even though there are obvious complications due to, the current politics. Sary Zananiri, the artist, and I have a couple of questions before we come to an end of our podcast. First of all, I want to mention to our listeners saryzananiri.net, which is your website. And while I was browsing your artwork, I became fascinated with two of your sort of small exhibitions here. One is called Unpicking Jerusalem, and you have an amazing picture taken in Mamilla market, where you are overlapping, I would say, in early pictures of what it looks like British soldiers essentially walking the same street. What is that you are trying to tell people browsing your material? I mean, for me, it was fascinating, and I'll tell you how sort of the image I had in my mind. I lived in London for quite a long period of time. And, Mamilla reminded me a little bit of Oxford Street, particularly because here you have the big sign Castro. And when I saw all of these people, British, it really reminded me people walking on Oxford Street, going for a Saturday afternoon shopping. But this is my view.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Mamilla is such a fascinating space, geographically speaking, I mean, before 1948, it was the geographic heartland of the city, the main commercial district. And it's sort of, it's the part of Jerusalem that as the old city started getting crowded and people started moving into the suburbs, it was sort of the overflow from the, Jaffa Gate, which had been the sort of the commercial district, into this new commercial district. And so when we kind of think about that space, it was a very dynamic space, both in terms of mercantile pursuits, but also culturally. I mean, still today within Mamilla Mall, there's the facade of a cafe that people like Khalil Sakakini used to go to. So we sort of need to think about this as a sort of a central node, but also one that was split in two by the Nakba by 1948. So this area kind of went from being the center to being a periphery within the divided city. And so for me, there's something fascinating in kind of looking at Moshe Safdie's new mall, which has won these prizes for heritage protection, which I find personally a little bit ironic, given how very little of the district is actually left. But there are these sort of elements within the mall that were literally, there's a number of buildings that were taken apart, stone by stone, numbered and then put back together and replaced into it. And so for me, what I found interesting about that space is this sort of attempt to restitch something that you know, I mean, it's, as much as I love Jerusalem, it's a very broken city, you know. And this mall is sort of an attempt to sort of patch that over. And there's something really sort of fascinating about how well that's done on the one hand, but also how badly. Like when you walk through the mall, the contemporary mall, like you know, it does look like it's been there forever. It's made out of the same limestone that most of the city is made out of. It has these arches. It has this sort of open. I mean, they didn't choose to do something that was, you know, that was enclosed. You know, it does sort of attempt to replicate a sense of what was there, but it's also very much not what was actually there, with the exception of this handful of buildings. I mean, I think one of the other really interesting buildings in that area is the Palestine Broadcasting Services building. And then there's the Clark House, which is one of the few houses or the few buildings that was never actually moved. But it's a very strange space. And part of juxtaposing these two photographs was actually showing just how bizarre that space actually is, you know, because they are photographs of the same, like taken from roughly the same position, showing roughly the same sorts of areas. So they were also printed on glass as well. So there are these sort of windows, if you like, that enable the two images or multiple images to be overlaid on top of one another. And part of kind of doing that was sort of thinking about the disruptions to this space and how even though there's a sort of an attempt to aesthetically make it seamless, there is still a very fundamental disruption.
I found personally Mamilla a fascinating place. And every time I'm in Jerusalem, I'm walking down the main street of the Mamilla Mall, and it's hard to understand exactly the dynamics that are occurring there, because there are, obviously, as you mentioned, these buildings and these buildings are not artificial because they're made of the same limestone that was there before, but at the same time, it's a reconstruction. And when you look at the crowd, it is very much an American crowd in a sense that it's mixed. And in fact, you know, it's about various Jerusalemites coming from different parts of the city, plus tourists walking together, essentially. And yet it feels that these people are separated. And this is like my feeling whenever I walk there, or I get to, you know, stop for a coffee and I'm listening to conversations via the variety of languages spoken: Hebrew, Arabic, English, French, Spanish, Italian, German, and so forth. And still you get the sense that there is a line separating them.
Yeah. I also think there's something fascinating about its geographic positioning, because, you know, one end of it is at Jaffa Gate and the other end, you know, puts you firmly in West Jerusalem. Not that the mall isn't in West Jerusalem anyway, but it's, you know, it's this very sort of interesting kind of space, which kind of, you know, it is a space of transition, you know, from Arab East Jerusalem to you know, Jewish West Jerusalem. And I think that also sort of adds to some of the awkwardness around that space. You know, in some ways it does have some of this cosmopolitanism that it, you know, very much has this sort of same sense of cosmopolitanism that it might have had, you know, in the 20s or 30s or 40s. But it's also a very strained cosmopolitanism, which is, you know, as you said, you know, it makes it a very weird and strange space. And sometimes I wonder, you know, when I think about the politics, particularly, you know, in the 30s and 40s, when things started to get politically tense, was this like this then, or was it something else, you know? And I don't suppose that's a question that any of us will ever be able to answer, but but it's certainly one that I like to pose to myself, you know, when thinking about how much things have actually changed.
Well, this indeed is a great topic for further research. The nature of cosmopolitanism, which you're right, in the current situation, when you walk around Mamilla, you really get the sense that it's cosmopolitan, but then the question is, what kind of cosmopolitanism we were experiencing when we walk down the mall. You have another series of pictures about still Jerusalem, but my question is very simple. Is your Jerusalem in color or in black and white?
I think I've come to the conclusion that there are many Jerusalems. I think one of the things that made me interested in Jerusalem as a city was trying to reconcile all of these images that I'd seen. I spent my teenage years hunting through secondhand shops for images of Palestine and Jerusalem, among other things, and trying to reconcile these sort of generally very biblical photographs with the sort of family stories that I'd heard of the city. And I mean, I certainly remember the first time I went to Jerusalem. I was 18 at the time, so I was, grown up-ish. And I remember it felt very familiar, And I think it felt familiar because of family connection, because of seeing all of these photographs, because of seeing, But I do remember this one incident. We were in the old city as a family. And I remember there was an old man wearing a keffiyeh, an abaya. And I can't even remember what part of the old city it was that we were in, but he was walking down a set of stairs. And I remember my dad said to me, "Quick, take a photo." And I reflect back on that now. I was a bit too slow with the camera, and it was the old days of film, so you had to you had to take a little bit more care. But I do remember sort of that incident very well, and I think to myself, what is it about that particular photo that he felt needed capturing?
Thank you, Sary. It's been great having you here at Jerusalem Unplugged. I hope the listeners enjoyed our conversation. Please visit saryzananiri.net website to enjoy his exhibitions, and join us at all social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook page. Please subscribe to our podcast and follow us. And get ready to the next episode of Jerusalem Unplugged. Thank you.